Good evening, everyone. My name is Kate Gibson. I'm the Associate Director of the Billing Center for the American West here at Stanford University. And we're so pleased that you're able to join us for today's event with Sarah Keyes. Dr. Keyes will talk about her recent book, American Burial Ground, A New History of the Overland Trail, which gives a new interpretation of the mid-19th century overland migration to the Pacific, shining a light on how the graves of westward migrants on the trail became seeds for U.S. expansion. Dr. Keyes is an associate professor of history at the University of Nevada, Reno. And after earning her PhD at USC, she spent a year at the Lane Center as a postdoctoral fellow. So please join me in welcoming back to Stanford and to the Lane Center, Dr. Sarah Keyes.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks to the Bill Lane Center for hosting my talk this afternoon. I'm really excited to be here at Stanford. I grew up in Palo Alto. Some of my family and friends are here this afternoon. And I spent many wonderful hours working on this book on this lovely campus, and it's just great to be back to talk about American Burial Ground, A New History of the Overland Trail. Now, many of you are likely familiar with the history of the Overland Trail or trail. So, right, this is a migration where white people moved westward in white-topped covered wagons. And this was a migration that was not only a major moment in the mid-19th century, it's also had a long life in American popular culture. So, in many ways, white-topped covered wagons are inescapable. They were cinematic icons of the mid-20th century. This is from the 1930 epic Big Trail. You might recognize John Wayne. From 1967, we have another depiction of the westward moving wagon train. This one I like because it brings in the classic domesticity of the movement, that it's these families moving westward, all their possessions in tow in these white-top covered wagons. So you have the women and children walking alongside the wagons, the men driving them or often riding on horseback. This is very much in line with gendered divisions of 19th century labor on the trail as well. And then we have white-top covered wagons dominating screens today. So it's not only cinema, it's also television. This is a still from 1883. I don't know if anyone's watched that series. It's a recent series by Taylor Sheridan, who's making a lot of what people are calling neo-westerns. And it is about a wagon train journey in 1883 from Texas to Montana. I love this particular still because of the storm, which was generated with computer graphics, but really depicts the challenges of weather that immigrants faced while they traveled. And it's not only television, it's also games. This is a still from the redesigned Oregon Trail game that was redesigned in 2021. And then this, we have a screenshot from the 1990s version, which is the version that I played, that classic green and black. I don't know why the wagon looks like a paper towel roll, but it does. And so the point here being that white top covered wagons are everywhere in popular culture, and they're still everywhere into the 21st century. And so when we think about the Overland Trail, we need to think about it not only as an event that lasted for 2 decades, 1840s, 1850s, and really into the 1860s, but also one that persists in popular memory, a story of triumph, a story of hardy immigrants pulling themselves west. And so I want to talk a little bit here about how that interest in the meaning of the trail and its memory intersects with the actual event. And I want to talk about it through the fact that I use the term Overland Trail in the title of the book. Because as many of you probably know, there's a lot of different routes that people take across the continent. This is a map that this wonderful cartographer, Aaron Greb, made for my book. So there's a multiplicity of routes, but I really use a singular term. And I use the singular term because these routes were linked together as having the same meaning. That you could make it all the way to the wonderful Pacific where we are today. That you could cross the continent and make it to Oregon and California. So there's a specificity to the physical travel. But when people think about these journeys, they think about them as linked, that you too made it to the Pacific coast. And so I'm less interested in parsing these routes, although there are many distinct ones, and more interested in how people talked about their meaning of their journeys. And this is very much something that they talked about, the shared experience of this suffering and going all the way to the Pacific. And what I argue in the book is that the shared trials and tragedies of the trails is really what helped to link them together and really helped it to transform not only the trails themselves, but the entirety of the West into a landscape of white American suffering and sacrifice. And I have to say, when I started doing this research, I did not go looking for this suffering and sacrifice. If you had told me, I raised in a pretty agnostic household, that my first book would have had a cross on the cover, I wouldn't have believed you. But maybe I should have, because when I was a kid playing that Oregon Trail game, it was all about whether or not you were going to survive. Will you die of dysentery, which has become sort of a classic comment on the game, or will you make it to the Pacific? I lost the game a lot. That's not really my thing, right? But if you lose in the game, there's no Oregon for you. You have to start over with a new team heading west. That's game over. It's the end of the story. And I found in the actual historical event of the migration that that was so far from the case. That yes, there was death and suffering and loss, but that was the start of the story. As I looked into trail documents and I looked across other sources of the 19th century, I found that the deaths along the way changed the experience and meaning of the trail for travelers and for Americans at large. These are people at home sitting in their armchairs waiting for the next account of the trail to come in. And they're reading about these deaths far away and they're trying to figure out where they are on their maps. And so these deaths along the way really shape the trail and they give it new life. And they ultimately help to advance westward expansion. This doesn't mean that the deaths of these travelers, of these immigrants, weren't a loss, that they didn't mark failures. I mean, if you're migrating somewhere and you don't make it, whether it's to Oregon or to California, or as we're tragically seeing now at places around the world like the US Mexico border or the Mediterranean Sea, you're trying to cross that, you're trying to get somewhere else, you don't make it, of course that's a loss. But graves along the Overland Trail also ultimately become something else. They become these markers of white possession. And they become this because of the specific context of 19th century white Protestant culture and because of the political urge at the time for expansion. And I share this image here to give you a sense of the work of death on the Overland Trail. So this is by cartographer and draftsman Joseph Goldsboro Bruff, better known as J. Goldsboro Bruff. Some of you may be familiar with him. And he becomes one of the best known recorders of graves along the Overland Trail. And this sketch, Immigrant's Burial, shows Bruff's mail mining company burying and marking the grave of Charles Bishop. Now, one of the conceits of commentators and immigrants in the 19th century was that men would not be good nurses, that they would not be good caretakers, that they would not care for people in sickness, and that they would not care for them after their death. But instead, what you see in trail documents is you see men again and again taking on the roles that they need to on this migration. And we see it here as well with them taking care of Bishop's body. So, what I found is that suffering and sacrifice is at the center of the experience and the cultural narrative of this migration. But there's been an overwhelming cultural and historical production of interpretations of the trail that dates back to the 19th century that have depicted the overland migration as something else, as a caravan of covered wagons transporting men, women, and children across the sunny plains. It's triumphal, it's a heroic, it's a peaceful story of hardy immigrants surmounting obstacles like the mountain depicted here to reach the fertile lands of Oregon and the golden lands of California. So I love this painting. So Leutz is a historical narrative painter. He's also famous for painting Washington crossing the Delaware. Do you all know what I'm talking about? Okay. And then about 10 years later, the Union government commissions him to paint an image of westward expansion for the U.S. Capitol. And this is what he comes up with. He finishes it in 1862, so it's in the midst of the Civil War. And there's a lot we could talk about in this painting. We talked before about the detail on Charles Bishop that we'll go back to, but all these historical narrative paintings are so amazing in that it's not only what's included inside the main canvas, but what's around the edges that also tell the historical story. Um, but I just want to focus on one portion of this painting for now. But if we want, we can go back to this in the Q&A. So I want you to look here. It's dark and shadowy. It depicts just like rock and some foliage and some greenery. But there's something missing from here that was in the original mural study that Leutze did. So of course, when these painters are designing their imagery, they're going to do drafts. And the mural study was basically Leutze's second to last draft. So it almost makes it into that final version we just looked at, but it didn't. And so this is the piece from the mural study that has the missing scene that was removed from the final painting. And we're going to zoom in a little bit here. Can everyone see what's going on there? Yeah. So it's another burial scene on the trail. This one's different from the Bruff and the Charles Bishop. In large part, it's different because we have a close-up of the actual act of burying the corpse. It's also different because we have a woman kneeling in mourning at the side of the grave. That imagery of women mourning for the dead was a really key component of 19th century culture around mourning. But I show you this because Leutze is tasked to celebrate westward expansion. The Union government is getting a lot of power, control, money from westward expansion during the Civil War. It's really important to their Civil War effort. And so it's a triumphal story. It's a sunny, peaceful, heroic story. We should go west. We have gone west. We are successful at this. But he's also recognizing the death, and it almost makes it in the final version. So even at the time, even when he's telling this sort of, one-sided angle, it was still there. It was still at the forefront of his mind. Do you have a question about this painting?
Can you explain how the westward expansion fueled the government financially?
Absolutely. So one really good example of this is gold from California, silver from other mines in the West. They're really financially important. There's been some really great work recently on the importance of the West to the Civil War effort and how both the Confederacy and the Union government were working really, really hard to control these territories because they were so strategically important, in large part because of the financial gains that you could get from controlling those mining interests. Yeah, that's an excellent question.
Do you know where this work is hung today?
Yes, so it still hangs in the U.S. Capitol. So one of the things I got to do when I was doing research in D.C. was go see it in person, which is really impressive. It's quite large. I wouldn't describe it as monumental, but it is quite large and arresting. Yeah, so I think you should be able to still see it today. And if you're interested in knowing more about the painting, the architect of the U.S. Capitol has a fantastic website where they go into much more detail about the painting, and they have a really high definition version of it as well. That's a great question. Yeah.
At the Smithsonian?
No, it's in the U.S. Capitol building, but you are correct. The Smithsonian American Art Museum holds the mural study. So that is there, but the final painting is under the auspices of the architect of the U.S. Capitol. Yeah, those are really good questions. So let's go back to Charles Bishop. We had a question about what's going on up here on the top. So I want to show you the Bruff sketch again. So the Leutze image was seen by a lot of people, right? But I want to show you the Bruff sketch again because it's giving us even more additional detail about the challenges of burial on the trail and also how folks did it, right? And so so this here, I think we can kind of all figure out that's probably like a funeral procession, right? But notice like how well ordered it is. They're all in formation. They are going up on this hill to honor their dead comrade. Any ideas why they might have placed the burial here rather than, say, maybe closer to their tents?
A trail marker?
Trail marker? Okay, can you tell us a little bit more about what you're thinking about that?
Well, if the trail is lost amongst hills and you see a grave marker, you know the people have been that way before.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point. So one of the things when I was looking through the primary sources that I realized is how important graves were to being these trail markers. And when people wrote home, they would often describe their route and they would say, well, the way I figured out how to go is I just followed the graves along the way. Absolutely. You want to be able to see them. You want to know where you're going. Why else might they want to make sure that people who came later could see Charles Bishop's grave? Any ideas?
In case there were any relatives of his.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Relatives would want to know where he was, be able to visit the grave. Yeah.
Would they use it as marking points for a road or something?
Yeah, actually, yeah, that's exactly right. So knowing that this is where people have gone before, that they're on the side. And one of the things that shifts in terms of visiting trail graves is that trail grave visits are important not just for the relatives of those who have died. They're important for every traveler. That they feel this communal social responsibility to pay their respects to all of these dead immigrants. And that's different than what they would have done for an ordinary man like Charles Bishop if he was at home. Because if he was at home, he would have been an ordinary man buried close to home. You wouldn't have told everyone that he was from Washington City, by which they mean DC. They wouldn't have needed to do that because he would have been buried in DC and it would have just said Charles Bishop. So they have to make changes to the marker. They have to tell people where he was from. And then they also have to expect that all immigrants who don't know who this man is will come to visit his grave because they know he's a fellow immigrant who's lost his way and whose family isn't going to be able to visit him as easily as they could if he'd stayed in Washington City. So this is a time period in the mid-19th century when there's a few graves of famous people that folks will travel to visit. One example, George Washington's tomb at Mount Vernon. That's already a tourist site for people in the United States by the 1840s. It's a way to honor the first president. It's a way to participate in American citizenship by going to visit the grave of this very prominent man. People are not visiting the graves of ordinary people. This is not a time period, for example, when we even have major military cemeteries to ordinary infantrymen. That's something that's going to come later during the Civil War. So the fact that Charles Bishop is buried and that he's buried on a rise so that others can visit him means he has become part of a special group in the 19th century. Someone who's buried, undertaking this very hard and trying journey, someone who's buried very far from home, and because of that, he's in a special category. And this is a time period in the leading up to the Civil War. We're like a decade out from the Civil War. We're still Northerners and Southerners are being buried together, where people from across the United States are going to visit everyone in a way they simply wouldn't if they'd stayed at home. And so Charles Bishop becomes special because of his location, because he died on this trail, which people see as good for national expansion as this very trying journey. Yes,
This is very different than the Native American burial.
that's a really good point.
So
What are you
in the ground, or there's no, I mean, it's above ground, fire and all that stuff, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So, Charles Bishop is buried between Scotts Bluff and Fort Laramie, which means that he's buried between Nebraska and Wyoming. And a lot of the indigenous peoples in that part of the world practice what you're describing, air burials or scaffolds, raising the dead. And they did not practice these below ground burials. Other indigenous peoples did. For example, a lot of the native peoples who lived in the southeast of the United States did bury their dead. But on the plains burial, they didn't. It's very distinctive. And the immigrants on the trail will talk about this as well. Talk about why do they do this? What does this mean? And they will actually find some commonalities between their practices and those of the native peoples of the plains. Yeah, yes.
Uh, the reason why the Southeast Native American populations buried their Pete's dead in the ground, could that be the influence of the colonists and, the, and because they quote the civilized tribes?
Sure. There was certainly a lot of um, such a great point. Certainly a lot of cultural exchange and what we might call syncretism, where people would adopt their cultural mores to take things from other cultures. Um, but I don't think that Native peoples of the Southeast specifically changed burying in the ground in order to sort of assimilate or adopt white cultural mores. It was really a practice that was common to the plains among certain groups. And that's why we see it in that region of the country. Do we have another question? Yes.
Can you read his marker to us? I can.
Yes, I can. Charles Bishop of Washington City died July 8th, 1849 of cholera, aged 25 years. So we talked a little bit about Washington City edition being unique. Age, super common. Date of death, common. Cause, pretty common to be on a marker. The fact that he died of cholera makes him even sort of less extraordinary among the immigrant dead because it's epidemics of cholera that are going to claim the most lives. So yeah, thank you for asking that. Oh, and then the other one just has his initials and an angel. So yes. And then there's stones on top. And those are there for the specific purpose of protection and trying to maintain the grave because they have to leave these graves behind. And so the trail becomes this treacherous trek, and it becomes a story of death and the marking of these graves. But it also is something that is not, as you all have pointed out in your wonderful questions, it's not something that's unique to the immigrant experience. That Native peoples, of course, have their own death practices and their own ways of connecting with their dead. And what I found in doing my research is that shared commonality of the importance of how do we maintain our connections with our loved ones after their deaths, how do we care for their physical remains, is what helps to connect the history of the Overland Trail, which is a history of white westward expansion, with the history of Native peoples. And the primary thread or arc of the history of Native people in the 19th century is one of dispossession, of losing their homelands through various means, whether it's through treaties and treaty rights that aren't fully honored, or through all-out wars that are waged against them by the United States military. And so this map here is from a digital project that a historian at the University of Georgia, Claudio Sant, did. And it depicts the state of Native homeland in blue in January 1850. So we're about 6 months after Charles Bishop was buried between Nebraska and Wyoming. So come around here, right? And then this is the state of territory in January of 1893. So this visual gives you a really good sense of how Native people lost title to so many lands over the course of the 19th century. But what I found is that Native dispossession and fight against it was really connected to them talking about the graves of their dead and the importance of their ancestors. So I came across this quote when I was doing research for the book, and it was actually from a book that's about the politics of death in 20th century Europe. And there's a Serbian nationalist, and he's talking about, where the boundary lines of Serbia are. And he's like, I don't really think about boundary lines that way. Do you know where Serbia is? Serbia is wherever there's a Serbian grave. Okay. And so there's a similar logic, sort of a similar argument that white Americans take in the 19th century. So you put Bishop, he's out in that blue, but he becomes kind of this node of American claim to the land. And so that's why these immigrant burials become so important, not just in the mid-19th century, but down into today, because they're still remembered today. But what I also realized in doing research for this book, and this is the part of the book that took me the longest to figure out, but what I realized is that what immigrants were talking about in terms of the claims of their dead on the land, the importance of memorializing them, how it connected them to these places. This was a conversation that had started decades before Bishop was buried in 1849, decades before white immigrants were surging across the trail at the start of the gold rush. And it was a conversation that had really first sort of risen to the top of American discourse about land, claim, possession, because of a conversation that Native peoples were having with the United States on various levels, either talking to politicians or writing in the newspapers to the general public, what they were saying about how they were defending their homelands in the decades leading up to forced removal. And so Native peoples are talking about the graves of their ancestors as their claim to their homeland. Do not remove us from the graves of our ancestors. And they're also having a very sort of similar experience, again, decades earlier, to immigrants to having people die when they are eventually forced on these removal routes to the West. So, what I've just brought us to here is a screenshot, and I have the entirety of the quote that was written by Eliza Jane Ross here transcribed, so you can see the portion of the letter I want to draw your attention to. So, Eliza Jane Ross is the niece of John Ross, who is the principal chief, or basically the president of the Cherokee Nation. And she writes to her uncle in 1842. So it's a few letters after the Cherokee have been forced on their removal to what we now call Oklahoma. And she's talking about the horrors of that removal route and the fact that there are so many of their people who died on that trail and are now left behind. So they're strewn along its entirety. And again, they're isolated in strange lands. There's no friends to watch over them, right? So perhaps try as they might to get them on a rise, like we got Charles Bishop on a rise so people could visit him. That's one of the major losses of this forced migration. The fact that these bodies were left behind on this forced removal route. And so Eliza Jane Ross is just one example of the many, many Native peoples who talked about their dead in these ways. And they did so specifically to argue for change in how the United States was treating them. And this was a piece of the book that I came to at the end. And so in the rest of the talk, I want to just talk a little bit about sort of the process of my research and how I came to this point. And we'll return to Eliza Jane Ross and also put her in this larger context of Native resistance to removal, as well as their persistence and their remaining connection with their dead. So when I started my research, I talked a little bit about playing Oregon Trail and like that horrible paper towel wagon, right? So that was one thing that got me interested in this migration. Another thing that got me interested in this migration was a summer I spent working at the Fort Caspar Museum, which is on the Oregon Trail in Wyoming. Has anyone been there? It's kind of like smack dab in the middle of Wyoming. My mom raised her hand and said she'd been there because she had, and I think she took this photo of me. I've got a hat on. I'm standing in the shadow. So this is a really interesting moment for me. I spent the summer, I was completely outside. If you spent time in Wyoming, it's a very different landscape from here, right? It's much drier. It's windy all the time. I got the worst sinus infection I ever had. But it's also the best way to experience the trail. And that's what it was like to be outside for 5 or 6 months as you're traveling in wagons across the continent. And I also knew I was going to graduate school, so I spent a lot of time reading Western history. And I realized that there were a lot of folks who would come to the museum, super interested in trail history, knew a lot about it, had a lot of good questions. And then in the history books I was reading, I realized that no academics had really written about this topic in decades. So I was wondering what was going on there, because it's clearly still of interest to the public. And from what I was learning through my internship, a very fascinating and important migration. So I began to think about what kind of research it might be possible to do with this topic. Could it be a viable research topic? What would I come to? How could I say sort of something different about it? And one of the major trends in Western history is thinking about how to incorporate the many peoples of the West into history. So how could I tell a history of the trail that, for example, paid attention to the history of Native peoples as well? So those are sort of the questions that were dominating my research when I started doing work in trail diaries and trail letters. How many folks have read maybe more than a dozen trail diaries or trail letters? Very good. Or just a couple. Yes. So many of you, right? There are these really amazing sources, and there's so many of them. So you can find them at archives across the United States. So I did work at the Autry in Los Angeles. I did work at the Newberry Library in Chicago. It's not only that these sources are everywhere, but there's a great variety to them. So many of them can be found as standalone documents. This is a scan of a diary in the Utah State collections. That's a standalone diary. I always just loved this one because he had his draft and his final version, which was a really nice to compare and contrast how they edited their accounts. You can also find these accounts as part of larger familial collections. So this image here is from a letter that's part of the Shaw Webb Papers, which is a major family collection at the American Antiquarian Society in Massachusetts, right? So just confirming that these sources are everywhere. And then this source, this one I loved. I was at the National Archives in DC, and there's even accounts of trail journeys there. And this one came from a pension claim that was filed by Edward J. Bartholomew. And Bartholomew served in the Civil War, but he was also part of an infamous immigrant party of 1849, the Jayhawker Party, that gets lost in the Mojave Desert on the way to California. And so, as part of his pension claim, his comrade on that journey, John B. Colton, wrote and talked about Bartholomew's sort of hardiness, his strength, and also the injuries that he suffered on that journey to California in 1849. And so these sources are just amazing. They're everywhere. And if we think about them not only individually, but collectively, whenever I'm thinking about them in that sense, I always go back to the words of Dale Morgan, who was a historian who was originally from Utah, but worked at the Bancroft Library for years. And Morgan called the sources a mosaic in words, right? So it's these little fragments put together of the personal experiences of the hundreds of thousands of immigrants who pinned their hopes and set their sights on reaching the Pacific. And this wasn't easy for a lot of them, right? You have pretty widespread literacy by the mid-19th century, but you can see when you read these things, some people were really struggling. And they're struggling not only because maybe their writing's not the best, they're struggling because they're as tired as they've ever been, and they're anxious about making it to Oregon or California before the snow sets in the Sierras. And so I'm wondering about how to say something new. I'm trying to figure out what's going on with these sources. And I realize that the common thread, what links this great diversity of stories of people going on these different trails, of people coming from different walks of life, is that attention to death. There's Silas Newcomb, an immigrant from Wisconsin who visited his mother's grave to say goodbye before heading overland to the goldfields. There's Abigail Scott Dunaway, who described her family's efforts to bury her mother in painstaking detail, including how, as with Charles Bishop, they selected a spot on a rise that was both beatific and prominent, a place that could be remembered. There's also Vincent Hoover, who, when he and his parents left his younger brother John's body behind on the trail, consoled themselves with the thought that by placing him so close to the Platte River, he would find companionship in the sounds of the water. And then there was Sarah Nichols, who, as her husband and son traveled the California Trail during a cholera epidemic, begged them to return, to save their lives and her own. But they continued on. They left her warnings unheeded until her son Samuel died of cholera on a steamboat headed up the Missouri River Valley. Ultimately, Sarah's loss was mitigated in a way that most losses on the trail weren't. Her husband, George, brought her son Samuel's body home. Now, this was no easy feat in 1849, but George paid for a special double-lined coffin, and he also paid freight on a steamboat to take his son's body home to New York. And his presence brought some consolation to Sarah. And so as I let my sources take the lead, as I turned an empathetic eye to their accounts, I began to see how central death and dying was to the immigrant experience. And as I've gestured to previously in the talk, it remains central to the memory of the trail today. So this is a marker erected in 2015 by the Oregon-California Trails Association over the grave of Abigail Scott Dunaway's mother. So it's still remembered and it's still marked. And they actually had a reburial ceremony for her mother, and I could tell you a little bit more about that if we want in the Q&A. So this is death on the trail. This is what's happening to immigrants, how they're talking about it. And then I zoomed out from the trail to the larger context of death and culture in 19th century America, and it became clear that it made perfect sense. This is what they would be talking about. In the mid-19th century, pre-antibiotic United States, death was everywhere. It was omnipresent in a way that it just isn't in 21st century America. And that's not to discount the tragedies of COVID-19 pandemic or even what we're witnessing now with wildfires in Los Angeles. And one way to grasp this omnipresence of death is to grasp variations on one of the most common phrases of 19th century America, if I live. So this was something you might say to a conversation partner when talking about future plans, and it was certainly a phrase that appeared in many 19th century letters, the most important medium of communication at that time. So here's one example of a use of this phrase. So John Minto, who's circled in red here, sits down to Christmas dinner with his family in 1843, and he announces to them all, "If I live, I will go across the Rocky Mountains." And he did live, and he did cross the Rocky Mountains in 1844. He becomes one of the first immigrants to arrive in Oregon, and he recounts this story to historian H.S. Lyman in 1901. And, John lived a long time. He actually lived until 1915. He's 92 when he dies. But that was really unheard of for someone of his era. And many people born in the 1820s and 1830s, and that's the decades of birth of many of the overland immigrants, they have some of the lowest life expectancies of the entire 19th century. So Americans are powerless to prevent death, but they could and did choreograph their responses to it. They gathered to listen to their loved ones' dying moral instructions, and they dutifully narrated the scene for distant friends and relatives. With the soul gone, the body became the focus of memorialization. White Americans laid their loved ones out, they wrapped them in shrouds, they buried them close to home, and they waited for the day they would be reunited in heaven. As they had cared for their dead, anticipative survivors cared for their connection with their deceased loved ones. Until the day they would meet again, they fingered locks of hair, they gazed on miniature portraits, and most importantly, they visited their graves. Graves were seen as portals between the dead and the living, and tranquil places for the living to commune with the dead. And this embroidered mourning picture from 1810, which is sort of really the start of this cultural moment that I trace in the book, captures this role of the grave. This portrait or sort of art, uses the urn and willow motif, which becomes increasingly popular over the course of the 19th century. And it's a way to depict the grief of death by not making it scary or skeleton-y, which it was like in the 18th century. So the willow hanging overhead is a symbol of grief. And then the two urns that are resting on top of the tomb next to the mourners who have gathered, a girl and a boy, represent the dead who are buried inside of it. Most tombs would only hold one body. In this particular instance, there's two. It may be because they're babies and they're related, which is why there's two in one grave. But I don't know if any of you are familiar with this type of embroidered artwork that was done. It could be done by women or young girls who are also learning how to do it. And it's just very, very intricate and absolutely beautiful. And so it's the grave to which mourners form specific attachments. This is the reason why Sarah Nichols was in such despair that her husband and son might die on the journey. It's not only that they might die, but that they might die very far from home. It's also the reason why Margaret White Chambers, another immigrant who traveled to Oregon 7 years after John Minto did, described the fear of leaving loved ones on the trail as perfectly agonizing. Now, in the earlier sketch from Bruff, we saw a good depiction of how people cared for bodies on the trail. In this image, we see the fear and concern of what would happen to what was left behind. And this is a fear and concern for the physical remains of the dead, which wild animals could dig into and destroy. But you can also see from the scratches that are on this decaying marker how it's also a concern for the loss of the identity of the dead. The marker is destroyed. Where are they? They're everywhere and nowhere at the same time. You could lose the name John Smith. And Bruff, with this image, he's not only depicting this as an isolated case, right? He's calling it the fate of many. So this is the fear and concern. And this was the same concern that we saw Eliza Jane Ross articulate in 1842 in the context of the Cherokee people's forced removal route that happened, more than a decade before Bruff's sketch. And so Eliza's words give us a sense of that fear on those forced routes. But they weren't the first words that made me begin to be able to make this connection between Overland Trail history and death and the history of Native people. and death and dispossession. That connection, and I'm moving into the final section here, how I made the connection between Native history and Overland Trail history. That connection and those words came from someone else. They came from Andrew Jackson, who used his power to become one of the direct causal forces of Indigenous removal. So, in the period of my research where I was working to place immigrant descriptions of the emotional toll of leaving home and their dead behind in a larger context, I read a book by a historian named Susan Matt. And it's a wide-ranging book. It's really quite interesting. It talks about homesickness in U.S. history. And one of her claims is the fact that, contrary to sort of popular perception or stereotype, of course Americans were sad when they moved from home. They weren't these innately mobile people who always wanted to go west. And in this book, she included an excerpt from a speech that Andrew Jackson made to Congress in 1830. Jackson became president in 1828, actually the same year that Eliza's uncle John had become the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. And he's talking in this speech to Congress in December 1830 about removal, why it's good, why it's a little different than voluntary white westward migration. And so, as he puts it, talking about Native peoples like the Cherokee, doubtless it will be painful to leave of the graves of their fathers, but so what? How is this different from what they're doing? And when I read this, I thought, why would Jackson be talking about the Indigenous pain of removal from the graves of their fathers? He is a proponent of removal. He believes that Native people should be pushed out to make way for white settlers. And then I thought, and even if he doesn't agree with the showcasing of that pain, then why does he refer to it in his speech? He doesn't have sympathy for that pain. But we know that many representatives that he was speaking to and addressing did. So Jackson's Removal Act that allows the United States to really push Native peoples out, including the Cherokee out of the Southeast, that had passed earlier in 1830, so around May. And he's speaking in December, but it had barely passed. And so in this report to Congress, Jackson is telling them, well, how removal is going, and he's trying to mitigate Native pain by comparing it to voluntary westward movement. So his words in trying to equate voluntary and forced removal really demonstrate his disconnect, his attempt to sort of whitewash what's happening with the administration. But they also help me to see this widespread and coordinated campaign in which Native peoples tell Jackson he's wrong, and in which Native peoples lay the groundwork for enduring land claims, some of which we see being returned to them today. And so in the 19th century, we have that map of expansive dispossession. But if we take the long view from the 21st century, we're also seeing blips and moments in which dispossession is being corrected, in which it's turning back to Native possession. And Native peoples laid the groundwork for this return in the 19th century. And they lay it by arguing against removal every step of the way. And they lay it by surviving and continuing to persist and continue to hold those memories and that connection to their lands. And when they talk to whites about this connection and when they defend their homelands, one of the things that they always say is that this land contains the bones of their ancestors, as a Sauk leader said in Illinois in the late 1820s. Or as Ross says in 1836, John Ross, our brothers, talking to whites, is it true you will drive us from the tombs of our fathers and of our mothers? And this is a language that's not only repeated by Native peoples and their allies against removal, it's also something that comes to inform other political movements in the 19th century, including the abolition movement. So this third example comes from William Lloyd Garrison, who's one of the most prominent abolitionists of the 19th century, pushing for the end of slavery. And he's saying, this idea that maybe we'll emancipate some African Americans, but then push them out of the country and return them to Africa where they've never lived. He's saying, African Americans are opposed to this as Cherokee are opposed from removing the graves of their fathers. So this is language that is commonly known and referred to from multiple groups. Removal does happen on a large scale, but historians have also done some work to recover the fact that not every person is forced to remove, that there are some who remain. There are some who are able to evade these removals. And this final quote is an example of this. A Creek man who is found by travelers hiding in his homeland and says, "Please don't give up my spot because I am here and I want to stay here with the bones of my ancestors." And it's not only that Native peoples argue against removal on the basis of the bones of their ancestors, is that even when they're forced to leave, they reassert their claims to their lands, and they do so in part through gesturing to their graves. So this first example comes from a Choctaw man, George Harkins, whose words are published in Niles Weekly in 1832. He's literally standing on a steamboat pointing west away from his homeland, and he's nonetheless giving a speech saying, "This is the land of our ancestors. Here are their bones." You also have a Creek chief in 1835 who speaks out against forced removal, and he does so by likening the United States, who's taking his people's land, to grave robbers. So he's saying the soil you're taking is one that contains the remains of our fathers. So what you're actually doing is not only robbing us of our land, but robbing our dead. And that is like the worst charge you can level at someone in this time period. Because the idea that you would disturb a dead body, that you would dig it up, whether for scientific purposes or some sort of, economic benefit to yourself, you are absolutely the worst. You're absolutely on the lowest of the social scale. So he's saying that's where you are when he speaks out against that removal. And it's not only words, right? It's things that people do in the landscape or the pieces of the land that they take with them. One of the things that was really important to me in the book was getting ground or land in there because it's all about this space and how we're connected to either where we live or where we traveled or where we're dead are, right? So this third image is a stone memorial monument that the Wyandot erected before they were forced to remove. So some native peoples will try to hide their dead before they're forced to remove so that whites won't come and desecrate their graves. Others mark them as a testimony to their perseverance in the landscape. So this is one example of that marker. This last picture, we can all tell what this is, right? It's a little bit of dirt. So the Miami, when they're forced from their homelands to Kansas, they take clods of dirt or small stones from the tops of the graves of their dead and they put it in their pockets and they take it with them, so that they're taking that connection with them. So these are just some of the ways they maintain these connections. And it's not only the forced dispossession, the forced separation from their homelands that causes this distress and this emotional turmoil, along with all these other things. It's the fact that the removal routes themselves are so deadly. And they're partly deadly because there are cholera epidemics on these trails too, just like there are on the voluntary westward movement along the immigrant trails later on. They're also deadly because there's not a lot of financing and staffing for the type of care work you need to move people of all ages in what are often bad weather conditions. And so one of the things that you see is you see along the routes, Native people having to advocate for time, like the time Bruff's company had to bury Charles Bishop, to say, hey, no, we're stopping. This person is important to us. Hey, no, we're sick. We need help. And some of the U.S. hired deportation conductors try to find that help. But when you are with a wagon train that has cholera, you're not going to find a lot of people to help you because no one wants to get sick. So in one example in 1834, a Cherokee wagon train gets cholera and it just ravages the detachment. And in the space of 2 days, Black Fox lost his wife and 3 children. Will Tucker lost 4 sons. And then not only are you having sickness that's killing you, you're also supposed to be traveling. And so if you put someone who's sick in a wagon, it's a horrible place to be. You can imagine how hot it gets with the sun beating down on the top. You can also imagine how uncomfortable it is. There's no springs, right? You're on these iron encased wheels. And so one missionary who's reporting on the horrors of the Potawatomi's forced removal route describes the wagons as turning the experience of sick people into a torture, that they're confined in these spaces. They are not given a loved one or other person to help care for them while they're sick, and they're just loaded in these wagons with luggage. But Native peoples do what they can. They advocate for time to bury, and they advocate for time to care for their dead. But there's a lot of parallels, but very distinct situations. These aren't similar situations like Jackson tried to claim in these 2 migrations. And At first glance, the removal era and the Overland Trail might seem to have little in common beyond their iconic stature in U.S. history. But historians have begun to see them as inextricably linked events. On the one hand, journeys of forced dispossession help to enable ones of possession. They are, as distinguished historian Elliot West has termed them, in many ways twin migrations. But I think that training the spotlight of death on these two major events provides another way to connect them. What became the central plot of the Overland Trail and its role in national expansion, so risking death on the way, dying in unsettled country, and being buried far from home and family, had already been established as the central plot of the removal era. But these similar plots were turned to distinct ends. Indigenous people lived, narrated, and memorialized their experiences of death in opposition to, rather than in concert with, U.S. settler colonialism. In articulating their attachment to their homelands in terms of their sacred and emotional ties to the graves of their fathers, Indigenous peoples broadcast a particular form of placemaking that also became a metric against which their opponents measured white attachment to home. By the time white Americans began to create landmarks of death on the Overland Trail, they did so in a context defined by Indigenous activism against removal. Voluntary westward expansion and the contingencies of dying on the Overland Trail did not emerge out of a cultural vacuum, but rather a decades-long cross-cultural conversation about death, graves, and territorial claims. And so I want to end this afternoon with a call concerning the future of placemaking on the Overland Trail. As of now, most sites and monuments continue to foreground and center the immigrant experience. One prominent example is the Donner Monument, also called the Pioneer Monument, which sits high in the Sierra near where the ill-fated Donner Party camped, starved, and ate the dead during the winter of 1846 to 1847. As of today, the Pioneer Monument, erected in 1918, still stands high in the Sierra Nevada. In the spring and summer, warming sun heats the bronze figures at the top of the pedestal. With the snap of fall, chilly breezes begin to hint of imminent snowfall. Winter storms dust and shroud the Pioneer family in snow, but the snowpack doesn't reach the top of the 22-foot rock and stone pedestal built to commemorate the level of snow in 1846 to 47. When the native sons sponsored the monument more than 100 years ago, they envisioned it as a tribute to stalwart immigrants who triumphed and followed the suffering Donners to California. Today, the Pioneer Monument is a signal of how far we still must travel. As I've shown in my talk, placemaking along the Overland Trail and the use of death and graves to mark white suffering and sacrifice was also part of a larger project of white efforts to dispossess Native peoples, to claim their homelands as their own. The Donner Monument is one example of this placemaking, but there are many others across the West. It's now time to contribute to ongoing efforts to recenter Native peoples in the history of the U.S., the West, and the Overland Trail. Throughout most of the 20th century, remembering the Overland Trail as an immigrant burial ground furthered the goal of solidifying U.S. possession. But there are other ways to remember, ways that bring us closer to the past while also drawing the trail into the present and future. Thank you. All right, let's do questions, and I'll also make sure to go back to any slides where you all might have missed some detail or had some questions or follow-up thoughts you wanted to ask. Yes.
I'm just curious of the absence of, in your discussion and in what settlers were doing, of a kind of religious context. That it was about possession of land. It was political, essentially, context, and not a religious context. You usually think of death as being surrounded by religious context. When you think of, or talking about the indigenous peoples, there it's a very specific religious context because of the religious connection to ancestors. Explain the difference. Why was religion really not a part, or am I right? What was it not a part of this?
Yeah. No, I think that's an absolutely excellent question. And I think that a lot of my discussion of the religion was implicit in the discussion of the importance of the graves as portals to loved one. So this religious belief that you would be reunited with your dead loved ones in heaven after death is what makes the grave such an important portal, because it's how you can stay connected to them before you yourself die or before the resurrection. And so that in part, that belief helps to explain why trying to maintain the physical sanctity of the corpse is so important, and why the grave is the physical side of the dead remains. You need to know where it is so that you can keep that connection with your dead loved one for your afterlife or for when the resurrection happens and everyone comes back, right? And so I think I did make that a little bit more implicit than explicit, but absolutely. 19th century white Protestant cultural norms really dominate in the United States in this time period, and that's a really important part of how these graves that are placed in unique out of the country situations, this is in the decades before the Civil War when most people are buried very close to home, come to take on a very different meaning than they had in the settled United States. And it becomes very important to mark and remember them in this moment, predominantly for these familial religious reasons. And then as time passes, as later settlers move in and the trails in their backyard, then they become these also historic markers of earlier white presence. We've been here. This was the first white dead. We're along the trail. Yeah. So there's always a little bit of the politics because of the expansion movement and the conversation that's been happening because of Indigenous removal. But that more clear equation with what they mean politically will grow over the course of time. So that's a really excellent question. Yeah. Yeah.
Did you run across any accounts of people not burying their dead relatives, but taking them all the way to California?
Yeah, so that's a really excellent question. So the Nichols story where they take the son home to New York is fairly exceptional because they're on the eastern edge of the trail and they have access to those waterways to travel them. Exactly. Because as you know, traveling by land in the 19th century is really hard. Using water makes it a lot easier. But there are some people who return for their dead later and move them. There are others who carry them as long and far as they can, because one of the things that proper burial demands is not only proper maintenance of the individual grave, but that you are placed with others of your kind. So if you can find a cluster of immigrant graves and create a little, I call them burial clusters, I think in the book, along the trail, that's better. That's more companion for your dead relative than if you left them by themselves. There is one story about a religious leader from Missouri who leads his followers to Oregon and establishes something called the Bethel Colony. And the story that goes along with that migration is that his son, Willie, dies after they've planned the immigration, but they haven't left yet. And Willie's dying wish is, take me with you to Oregon. So there's a story that they do. And so that, again, playing into the religion and the symbolism of that he becomes like sort of the first marker in the ground of their settlement. He starts their cemetery when they move to Oregon. So there's that too. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah.
Is there some sort of a census or registry of who the immigrants were to the various trails?
That's such a good question. And we don't have as much source material as we liked. There was like a registry at Fort Laramie where a lot of folks stopped, but it's partial. It's not completely saved. There's also the most sort of tracking of immigrants comes to be in newspaper reports on the eastern edges of the trail, so places like Missouri. And oftentimes the point of origin of the immigrants will be noted there, as well as how many people are traveling. But we don't know for sure. Historians are actually speculate that we used to think a lot of the immigrants really came from, Missouri, Iowa, these places on the edge of the trail. But historians have speculated that there's probably more people who came farther east, but then their point of departure might have been listed instead of their point of origin. So then we're thinking about an even more diverse swath of the United States. So that's one thing. It's not really the numbers question, but the origin question. And then for numbers, it's hard to track because a fair number of people do actually travel multiple times. Sort of this back and forth trip, right? And so, one of the things I would often get asked by other historians is like, you're talking about these immigrant burials, like compared to the massive numbers of people who died during the Civil War, it's very different. And I'm said that the magnitude of these dead is really in their meaning and the fact that they're strung across this very long trail. So yeah, numbers matter, but also this idea that your grave marker could be completely decimated, the bodies might be lost. They lead to this idea later in the 19th century that the immigrant dead in many ways could be anywhere and everywhere, right? Like they're still searching for these graves with cadaver dogs today.
Yeah. And so there were organized parties on these,
Yes.
like the wagons,
Yes.
the wagon groups. But then there were souls that undertook to go just a family.
Yes.
And so that's even more diffuse, I think.
Yes.
Is there literature that suggests that the individuals that attempted to go west traveled the same routes, or did they really?
Yes.
They just turned themselves to the wilderness.
Yes, they do attempt to travel the same routes. One of the things that happens is that the routes will shift over time, right? Like if all of the animals eat the grass along this one way, then you're going to try to find some other way to go. Or the water could change direction a little bit if there's a flood. And so this means that even though people have maps, right? Like there's a fair amount of cartographic production in the mid-19th century. Even if people have printed maps, or even if they're traveling with folks who've taken this journey before, they can still get lost or disoriented. And it also contributes to this fear and this actuality of graves being lost on the trail, because one of the things that happens is that families might pay or ask a friend or a neighbor to go visit the grave of a loved one on the trail, and then sometimes they can't find it. Like they have this description, it's under the cottonwood tree, like 2 feet from the Platte, and then they can't find it. Or they say, I did find it, but it's actually on the other side of the Platte and there's no tree.
I'm sure you listened on the alcove spring.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that's the site of the great Sarah Keys.
Yes.
But they have the stone there, but they're not quite sure where she was buried.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very common, of trying to correlate markers with actual remains. And that becomes more complex in cemeteries in the settled United States as well, because there was a practice of erecting a cenotaph. So like say your loved one died on the trail, you might not have the body, but you could set up a marker in the cemetery, give you some sense of connection, right? But the body's not really there, so where is it? So yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Did you find instances of people opting to stay with their buried loved ones and thus sort of create new settlements, or did people just generally move on, as hard as that was?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So that's actually the plot line to Taylor Sheridan's 1883, which I find really interesting, is that his Elsa, who's the teenage daughter of the Duttons, the main character family who's migrating, they basically choose their homestead where she's died, because she get injured, and then they bury her, and she's like sort of the start of their homestead. So it's a really good example of the way that these graves make unfamiliar lands seem familiar to these settlers. In most cases, uh, they're trying to move on, but they wish they could have done anything to take them with them. It's just like not physically possible. Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes.
I think you said that the military cemetery tradition did not really take root until the Civil War.
Yes.
So what was the custom for burial during the Mexican War, which is the same time we're discussing?
That's such a good question. And I remember some years ago asking a historian of U.S.-Mexico War, where did they bury the dead? And he was like, I don't really know. I think they did the best they could. One of the things that happens that I don't talk about much in the book, but is interesting, and again gets back to this religion question, is that when immigrants are traveling these more southern routes, they might go through Mexico, and certainly parts of the Southwest that were recently Mexican territory. Trying to get to one of those maps here. But they will be denied burial in the Catholic cemetery. So if there is an established cemetery close to the trail route in those places, it's probably a Catholic one, and whoever's around, the officials or local settlers, will tell the Protestant immigrants, you can't bury your dead here, and they'll have to carry them off. The Yes. So that's what I would say about that. There are also some military forts that increase in number on the trail over the course of the 19th century. So, like Fort Laramie is just one example, but there's others in Nebraska and other places across the West, and they will try to carry the military dead back to the fort for burial, but they're closer, right? And they have more resources in many ways than the immigrants. So that's a great question. Yeah. Would you have a question as well, sir?
The Native American, on the reservations, what do they practice? Do they bury their dead? Are they cremated?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I think it's pretty culturally specific to each group, right? But I think we can certainly see an evolution of burial practices in all cultures. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting in terms of the evolution of immigrant burial practices is they hold on to like these major things that are really important to them, which is including burying the dead in the ground is really important to the white immigrants. Um, but the way they bury them in the ground shifts because they also know they're vulnerable to these animals and other things. And so at home, they would just wrap them in a shroud and put them in a coffin. And they're absolutely horrified that when they're out on the plains, they often can't get wood for a coffin. They're gonna have to bury them touching the ground, right? So one of the things they'll do sometimes is they will cut the opening in the dirt in the shape of a coffin. So it's not just a rectangle, it's like a tapered box. So you can see these adjustments even as they're trying to like cling to what's most common and important for them. But you also see some immigrants say, I know we're doing this burial on the ground. That's what's important to us. But we can understand why some of these native people have elevated their dead. In some ways, they're kind of safer up there. Yeah. So, yes.
Is there any effort on the part of the United States to preserve them along the trail?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of important preservation efforts and works that are ongoing. I mentioned the Oregon-California Trails Association erecting that marker. They've done a lot of important work in terms of preserving those headstones and those markers. And one of the things that will happen when sort of later settlements come in. So in places like Nebraska that are close to the trail, in the late 19th and early 20th century, if they find an immigrant grave, they'll erect a stone marker because a lot of the ones that were erected in haste along the trail were just wood because that was what they had, or like a piece of a Cracker Barrel, whatever was extra, right? Um, but this idea of preserving them in perpetuity, this idea of going back to the grave is really important. There's a whole collection of stories from the late 19th century of sort of widowers who returned to the graves of their deceased wives with stone markers that they couldn't erect, in the 1850s. So that's an important part. This preservation story is ongoing. It starts in the 19th century about the importance of preserving them, and it goes down to today. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all so much for your time. You're a really wonderful audience.